40% Merlot, 40% Malbec, and 20% Cab Sauv.
For you,
2,000. Welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, the world in your glass.
I'm Marina Vataj, Digital Managing Editor at Wine Enthusiast magazine. In this week's episode, we ask Lauren Buzzeo, Tasting Director and Senior Editor, to debunk the most common wine myths. I also hit the streets of New York City to find out how much wine lovers really know. Turns out there are a lot of misconceptions and myths out there. Let's get to the bottom of it.
Lauren Buzzeo, Tasting Director and Senior Editor at Wine Enthusiast magazine.
We're going to ask you, the expert, all our wine questions. You cool with that?
Yikes.
It's going to be easy. All right. So one of the most common myths about wine is that expensive wines are better wines. Tell us, first of all, is this true or false?
I mean, you can't really make a blanket statement to say that just because a wine is more expensive or above a certain price threshold, that it will be of better quality than something that is significantly less. Now, there are reasons why wines may be more expensive than other wines. As an example, some of the greatest German wines are harvested from vineyards that are planted on very steep slopes. And therefore, the manpower and the machinery or lack of machinery that's required to actually get those wines, get those grapes pulled and get those wines made in the cellar is much more substantial than something that's, say, can be harvested by machine, no problem. Nice flat land. So as a result of that, you're going to see a little bit higher prices from wines from those areas. So there's a lot of different factors that might contribute to why a wine might be more expensive. But again, that's not to say that because it is, it's going to be of better quality. As we know, we taste over 22,000 wines every year, and certainly we taste plenty of wines that we designate as best buys. Those are wines that achieve a certain quality to price ratio. That can be, a $15 Pinot Noir from Central Coast of California. That could be 91 points. And certainly that could be comparable to a established, delicious red Burgundy that could theoretically be 3, 4, 5 times the price. But in terms of rating and quality, they're on the same level. So it's not a given that just because you're going to spend more on a bottle that it's going to be better, which is why what we do, it's so important for us when we're rating and reviewing wines that we taste everything blind. We do not know pricing when we're reviewing wines because we really don't want that to be a factor.
Right. That's really great. I'm happy to hear that you do not have to spend a lot to get a good bottle of wine, especially when you don't always want to.
Definitely.
So that's one myth you guys can just put away for the new year. Get a great bottle. Like
Save your dollars and just buy more.
I'm signing me up for that. Okay, so the next big wine myth, white wines with fish and red wines with meat. Now, I tend to be a little bit more adventurous with my pairings. I tend to think opposites attract.
Of course, you work here. Of course,
right.
You're more adventurous.
Exactly. But I do think there's a smidgen of truth to that, perhaps. But tell me, what do you think?
I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, when I'm having fish, I definitely tend towards white wines. And if I'm having a big, bold steak, I'm definitely looking for a hearty red that has a bit more structure, tannins, weight, concentration. But as you were saying, that's not to say that you need to treat them exclusively. There's certainly preparations of, say, heartier fish like a salmon that really goes beautifully with an earthy Pinot Noir, or even some shrimp preparations can go great with a juicy Barbera. So there are definitely ways to think outside of the box that you don't need to be restricted to one wine type over another. And that goes with meat as well. If you're maybe have like an ossobuco that's prepared with some citrus zest and trying to bring out some more acidity and liveliness, you might want to try pairing it with a white with a bit more verve than a really tannic, robust red that's going to just drown out that liveliness that you're going for. So there's definitely ways that you can play around that old, tired rule.
And you just happened to debunk another myth, which is that rosé is not just for summer. While we're on the subject of pairing, there are 2 pairing rules that I was taught, and obviously I've evolved out of, but I use as a reference. One of them is what grows together goes together. And then the second example, and that is when I have Thai food, I always have a Riesling. So what do you think about those 2 tips for pairings?
Well, what grows together goes together. Yeah, I've probably mentioned that because as an Italian myself, I mean, that's a rule that's in our blood. I mean, it just comes out that way. You naturally, if you have something with truffles, you're naturally thinking of the Piedmonte and the wines that go with all of that delectable cuisine with those truffles. So it's something that it might be old. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's tired, and it's still a good one to have in your stable. So I'm not going to say, let's debunk that myth. I'm not even going to call it a myth. It is a reality.
Yeah.
It's a good standby to go by.
Yeah.
But you don't need to be restricted by that.
All right. So here's another more serious myth, but I think it's a really important one. And that is the shape of a wine glass is irrelevant. I mean, I think I'm going to bring out the ultimate myth, which is champagne should be drunk in a flute glass. That I totally disagree with. I do think there is something sexy about a flute glass, and I think there's something celebratory about a flute glass. But I don't necessarily, and in fact, I'm sure the champagne industry would agree, that's the only way to enjoy champagne.
Honestly, on this one, Marina, I can't give you a true or false because I think that it's very subjective, and I think that I'm definitely going to agree with you about champagne flutes. It's not, in my opinion, the best vessel for really enjoying and getting the best expression of what's in your glass. However, I think that there's a very practical reason why people use champagne flutes. I think if you're toasting, I think if people, you're meandering around a party, whatever, it kind of keeps it a little bit more contained. And yes, you're right. It looks sexy. It looks festive. It's traditional in some aspects. So people know immediately you're drinking champagne and it's a party. And honestly, there's a lot less spilling in champagne flutes than other glasses. True. So I understand the practicality of the flutes in that regard. However, absolutely, a white wine glass with a little bit more opening for the nose and a little bit bigger bowl, or a bowl at all, to contain some of those beautiful aromatics that you're going to get in a sparkling wine is certainly important. So I'm going to say I agree with you on the champagne with regards to white versus red versus Bordeaux glass versus Pinot glass.
Right.
I can't get on board that there are so many and that it really makes a big difference.
That is a huge statement, though, and that is a huge debunking of this big myth. Rules exist for reasons, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say overall the idea behind these different types of glassware is sort of the distribution of the wine in the glass and how it hits your sensory system. So how are you smelling the aromas? Where is it landing in your mouth first? How is it affecting the swirl? I understand all those technical things, but I think as somebody who's trying to enjoy wine and learn about wine as a resolution or ever in life, I think it's a lot to tackle. I admit sometimes I have my Bordeaux and my Pinot Noir glass. And it's just something it really depends on how I feel.
I will admit that I generally drink out of only one glass.
Oh, is it one of those all-purpose glasses though, or is it?
It is not branded as an all-purpose glass. I'll tell you what it is. It's a glass that I picked up on a trip to Murano, Italy, with my family. That's very special to me. It's a beautiful glass. It has great weight for me. I prefer a little bit of weight in my glass. These new glasses that are very, very light are beautiful. But for me, I'm not a small gal. I feel like I need something a little bit more substantial in my hands. So my glass has a bit of weight to it, a nice solid bottom, a beautiful big bowl, but not too big. So I wouldn't go so far to say it looks like, what might be branded as a burgundy glass, a red burgundy glass.
Right.
I'd say it might actually be more comparable to what they would brand as a white burgundy glass. But that being said, for me, it works with almost everything that I drink. That's not to say, as you were saying, that there's technical or scientific reasons as to why these varietal specific glasses are created. I understand that there is, as you noted, the way that it hits the palate, the way that the aromas are concentrated or diffused.
Right.
So there's definitely sound logic and reasoning as to why certain glasses are created a certain way for different varieties. But the need to have all of those glasses and to always serve your, say, Sauvignon Blanc out of a Sauvignon Blanc glass, just I don't think it's really fully necessary for everyone to really do.
Right. Sometimes it just takes the fun out of it.
Yeah.
You just got to enjoy what you enjoy.
That goes back to that whole enjoying life thing.
Exactly.
I mean, you can't be bogged down in having... How many varietals are out there? I mean, you can't have a glass for everything.
All right, so this is another big one, and we may have touched on it a little bit when we talked about expensive wines, but I do think it's worth just saying out loud. Boutique wineries make better wines than big corporations. That's a big myth. True or false?
I mean, again, I have to say false there. You can't put a hard and fast black and white answer on really a lot of these myths. So I'm going to say generally it's not necessarily true. There are, however, certain qualities or expectations or reputations that you might have out of a boutique winery that might be a little bit more expressive of a region or a specific vintage condition than it might be with a larger production house or corporation that might have newer technology, different systems in place, different destemmers or sorters or presses or new tanks, whatever it may be. Generally, larger production wineries will just have a more consistent style year over year.
Today, we're in Union Square, New York City, to test people on their wine knowledge. What's in a Bordeaux blend?
I don't know.
Oh, a blend.
How about Cabernet?
Grape.
Close. What is champagne?
Bubbly.
Bad white wine with bubbles.
Champagne is sparkling white wine made in the Champagne region of France.
No other sparkling wine can be called champagne unless it's made there.
How would you describe tannin?
Tannin?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Tannin is kind of that taste that you get in your mouth. It's like...
So tannins, I know, are the things that give you a hangover.
So when you have a very big tannic wine and you feel like your mouth is very suddenly dry, your gums are really dry, that's tannin. What is the dominant grape in Chianti?
a red one.
We are going to find the wine experts in New York City. What grapes are in Chianti?
Sangiovese.
Bingo. What is in a typical Bordeaux blend?
Well, it's usually a Cab Franc, and a Merlot.
Why are they laid on their sides as opposed to upright?
Primarily to keep the cork wet so you don't get air breaching the wine and aging it prematurely or ruining it.
Congratulations, you are the wine expert of the day.
Age-worthy, quality wines are sealed with a cork. This is a hard one, but I'm going to say go.
It's a hard one because in reality, the verdict is still out. We're still pretty far away from having a solid answer on this one. So I'm not going to say yes or no.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fair. That's fair. It's just a tough one, guys.
But I'm going to say that it's definitely an interesting one, and it's certainly been a hot debate for about a decade now, and it will continue to, again, for decades to come, because the key here is obviously seeing how the same wine, which is what a lot of producers are doing now, they're bottling the same wine under cork and under screw cap, and they're laying it down and they're cellaring it, and then they're opening it up in intervals to come in the future to determine exactly how the aging process is different between the two closures. So
they haven't had quite enough time to do all that research.
Exactly. I think that it's, the arguments are out there for one versus another. I think we'll see what happens. I mean, going back to the champagne glasses, there is something inherently special and romantic about popping a cork.
I was just going to say the same thing. Yeah.
So a lot of people will really have a hard time letting go of that.
Yeah. She's talking about herself.
I have no idea what you're talking about. No, but I mean, on the flip side, it's super easy to open a screw cap wine. So
that's true.
I mean, when you're tailgating or whatever, train commuting.
Exactly. Okay, so this is a good one too. all big tannic wines just need more time to age?
No.
Okay. Tell us all things.
Generally, it's true that tannins will mellow with time. However, you really need to have a wine that has other elements of the same concentration and balance. It's all about balance. It's not a question of tannins. It's a question of balance. If you have nothing but tannins, they might mellow, but they're still going to be there.
Right.
They're still going to run the show in 5, 10, 20 years. You have to have the fruit to support the tannins. You have to have the acidity to balance everything out.
Right.
It's a complete package. So you can't just look at that one component and say, just because this is rough and big and tannic right now, it needs more time. It's not the case.
So if it's too alcoholic and it's too acidic and it's too tannic when it's young, it's going to be all of those things when it's old. And
Correct.
Time is not going to correct that.
But yeah, balance usually doesn't come more with time. Mellowing, harmonization, evolution. But if something is way out of balance, it's likely not going to change with more time.
You can't age white wines.
That's the worst.
Isn't that the worst?
I don't know where this came from.
I want to hear more about, Burgundy, but also champagne. Coming back to champagne, I love an aged champagne. And I have like a few bottles that I've gifted myself that are just like, I don't want to open them. I'm slightly terrified. Some of them may be too old, but I'm like, I just want to see what happens. So white wine can age. Let's just put that out there.
Absolutely.
Okay. So
Yes.
Give us hints. Tell us what.
Well, really a lot more than people probably think. I think generally as a culture, for whatever reason, we're kind of obsessed with things being too young, drinking white wines too young. There's a lot of wines that could really benefit from at least a year to 2 of just some settling, maturation, and just mellowing. It's funny, if you go into a retail shop and you see, as an example, I don't know, a 2015 Sauvignon Blanc from South Africa next to a 2014 Sauvignon Blanc from South Africa, let alone the treatment of how the wine was matured, whether or not one was oak aged versus one was not, the caliber, reputation of the winery, any different factors, put those even aside. And 9 times out of 10, if someone walks into the store, they're going to pick up the 2015 over the 2014 because they have in their mind that they need to buy the fresher white.
Right.
And it's just so crazy to me.
Right. Because it can be more fresh in different ways.
Well, and it's not just about fresh. It's not all fresh.
White wines, what's cool about white wines, I think, that are aged is that they actually can get super complex.
Yeah.
In ways that if you open them 1 year too soon, you don't have that experience.
So that's exactly the thing. You drink them too young and you're really doing a disservice to some of the other layers and nuances and flavors that could really come out with, again, just a little bit of time to just come together and mellow. Obviously you mentioned Burgundy. Of course, you can age wines from the Jura, Champagne, some beautiful Soave Classicos really can stand the test of time. There's countless options for white wines that could really mature beautifully given 2, 5, even 10 years in the cellar.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And now Riesling. German Riesling is another one of those
Forget
wines.
about it. Those are like endless.
Those are
cellar,
made right.
Yeah.
That's like, again, a classic example of something that you're almost doing yourself a disservice by opening it right away.
Yes, but I will say again, it comes down a lot to personal preference.
That's true.
Okay.
There's a lot of freedoms in wine. That's the point.
Absolutely. Whatever works for you. That's like talking about wine myths. Let's just debunk right here. Anybody that says, well, but this is what I think about a wine, but I'm not an expert. Guess what?
Yeah,
Nobody's an expert on anybody else, okay? Everyone's got their own palate, their own opinions, their own preferences, and everyone should feel free to feel confident and express those preferences.
Vintage. what is the deal with vintage? Okay, so a lot of people are like, oh, they had a terrible vintage in Bordeaux. I shouldn't buy the futures, or oh, that was a bad year in California. I think a lot of people don't understand even what vintage means. What does vintage represent for a winery?
The vintage represents the year that the grapes were harvested to make the wine.
Exactly. So what you're saying is really the climactic conditions of that year impact what the wine could result in.
Correct. Okay. And that's the key word that you just said, could result in. Okay. It's not a given. It's not a definite. A lot depends on different, again, vineyard techniques, practices that winemakers employ and vineyard managers. There's a lot more at winemakers' disposal now and vineyard managers' disposal now. There's a lot more tools and technologies that can really turn a bad vintage into an acceptable and or good one. So I think back in the day, whenever that might be to you, I think previously vintage mattered a lot more than it does today.
That's a good point.
And I think today, because of that, you're not really hearing too much about, well, that was a bad vintage. In fact, it's more the contrary, where it seems almost year after year, you're hearing that was a great vintage, or that was a good vintage. You're hearing a lot less of that was a bad vintage. It's taking really harsh, dire, really weather situations for people to say it's a bad vintage. And that's even accounting for, climate change and changing conditions that a lot of locations are experiencing. They're adapting to it. They're figuring it out. But again, with the advancements in technology, it's a different game today than it was certainly 20, 30, and even 10 years ago.
Is it fair to say that not every region has to worry about vintage if they have sort of a predictable weather pattern year after year?
Yes, there are definitely some regions where the weather conditions are certainly more consistent and regular than others.
So vintages matter less in those areas generally.
Correct. Yeah, I'd say I review the wines from Languedoc-Roussillon, and generally their conditions are fairly consistent year over year.
And what would you say are, say, one or two major regions where vintage does matter? Or has mattered?
Yeah, well, certainly, a few years ago we had very cool conditions in California, and that really had a drastic effect. But again, not necessarily negative, just different.
Different.
But that definitely had an effect on the wines from that vintage. So, yeah.
There you go. Good to know. So here's another one that came in that I think a lot of people want to hear an expert talk about, which is, are all Napa whites oaky? Now, a lot of people think Napa whites equals oaky. So when I am at a dinner party and people are like, oh, is that a Napa? Oh, I love it. I love the oak. Is that the case? True or false? And what are some things we can look forward to from Napa and white in general?
All right. Well, to start off, I'm going to say false.
False. That's a good sign.
I would not say that all Napa whites are oaky. I think that this probably largely came in more as, even set aside Napa, just like a California generalization.
I think that's true. Yeah.
I think a lot of people, I even did it, I think a few minutes ago, I said an oaky California Chard.
You did?
I think that there was definitely a time where that was the go-to style for California, specifically Chardonnay, was to be this really big, oaky, rich, buttery popcorn.
She sounds so excited.
It was a little
in
bit...
your face, sort of in your face.
It was a little bit of an overdone style. In my opinion, it's those wines, I understand that some people love them. They're a little too much for me.
Yeah, me too.
So again, there was a time where that was definitely the prevalent style coming out of California, that people thought if they were buying a Chardonnay that it was definitely going to be, buttered corny toast. I think that there's been a movement since, certainly in the past 5-10 years, let's go with 5, to move away from that. The ABC movement, the anything but Chardonnay movement. People sort of pushed back against those overdone white and over oaked white wines. So I think now today you're seeing winemakers use oak, especially in California, a little bit more judiciously, a little bit more cognizant that, more oak does not necessarily mean better, or longer aging on oak
or even more
oak
flavor
does not mean better.
Yeah.
Right. And allowing some of the, natural components of the grape and the other elements, the acidity, to really come through is definitely key. So certainly a lot of the Sauvignon Blancs out of California, there are some that are oaked, but you will certainly find plenty that are not. But in addition, they're playing with other varieties and a little bit, again, more cognizant that it's not really the thing that they should be known for.
Right. That's great. And also regions can change their style over time, and style evolves and techniques evolve. And now you can also find bottles that say unoaked.
Absolutely.
So if you're looking for a Chardonnay that's not oaked from California, they exist.
But I just want to throw out there, because this is another one I hear a lot. I don't like oaked Chardonnay.
That's also, that's another myth, actually. Yeah. Have you tried Burgundy?
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people have said that to me, and then I've asked them if they've tried specific wines, and they're like, "Oh, that's not that." I'm like, "Yes, it is."
Okay, so now I'm going to give the floor to you. Is there anything that I haven't tackled that you just really want to use this time to tell people?
I guess I'm just going to go back to what we sort of started with, which is, you and I, me and whoever, everyone out there, can talk endlessly about what they do or don't believe is right or wrong. The important thing is to pay attention to your own instincts and your own preferences, and just go with your gut. If you like something, if you don't like something, no one can tell you to like it. It's all subjective. It's all personal. And you should never, ever be ashamed or feel wrong for liking or not liking something that someone else does or doesn't. So I'm just going to say to every wine lover out there, be you, do you, enjoy life, enjoy wine.
It's a wine lesson and a life lesson, right? Happy New Year. Thank you so much for taking this time, Lauren, and teaching us so many wonderful things.
Thank you, Ms. Vataj.
I can't wait for next year's resolution.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is produced by Large Media, LARJ Media. Wine Enthusiast is made possible by grapes, sunshine, and wine, and by the hard-working editors who bring you news and information on your favorite beverage every day. If you like what we're doing, share our podcast with your friends and give us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For more fun wine information, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Wine Enthusiast.